Hello and welcome to A Celtic World, the YouTube channel and podcast that brings together the diaspora of Celtic fans all around the planet. From Galashiels to Gaza, Leith to Los Angeles, wherever you are, you're part of A Celtic World. And we'll say a quick hello to Stephen. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Gav.
And we'll make that quick because we want to say a longer and slower hello to our special guest tonight, John Wight. How you doing, John?
I'm very well, guys. Thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
And where are you joining us from in this great big Celtic world?
I'm in the Scottish borders in a place called Hawick. I'm originally from Edinburgh, but I've been down here for the last 5 years, so quite far flung, the three of us.
Hawick is like the comedian's favourite when they're talking about Scottish place names that should sound different.
Exactly. I just tell people who are not from Scotland, I'm from Edinburgh. I'm living in Edinburgh because it's a nightmare. It's a strange place, Hawick, in many ways. Sometimes it doesn't feel like you're in Scotland here. You know, I think it's like Scotland's deep south, banjo country. Mm-hmm. It's predominantly Rangers town, but there is a Celtic pub and there is a Celtic supporters bus that leaves from here. So there is an influence for sure.
All right, and we're talking to you today, John, because you are writing a book about Celtic in the 80s.
That's right, Jungle Days, supporting Celtic in the 1980s, which was a very turbulent decade in British Scottish social history. Thatcherism in the 1980s, she upended working class communities with her structural adjustment of the economy after she was elected in 79. And all that was solid melted into air, all that was holy was profaned, in the words of Karl Marx. And it was a very difficult time for working class people. And so Celtic, I think, was a beacon of stability amongst all that stability in a way that it never really had been since the Second World War. And it was a sanctuary. It was a real sanctuary for people looking for some kind of uplift, for some kind of inspiration, for some kind of belonging to something bigger than themselves, to forget their troubles. And it was a transitional time for Celtic on the park. You know, the glory years of the Lisbon Lions had obviously gone. The Quality Street Gang had finished. And you had the breakthrough of the new forum with McLean's Dundee United and Ferguson's Aberdeen, which broke the old forum duopoly. And it was a biscuit tin era for Celtic. You know, the ground was crumbling, falling apart. The main source of revenue was the turnstile. Crowds were quite low in those days because people never had any money. Unemployment had spiked. Inflation had spiked. So I remember if Celtic were playing a lesser team, say Kilmarnock or Morton or Airdrie at Parkhead, you know, disrespect to those teams, 20, 21, 22, 23,000. That was the norm. So the club never was not generating as much money as it needed to compete in Europe as it had been able to in the past. So it was an interesting time to be a Celtic fan, for sure.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we'll definitely get into that a little bit later on. This is set the scene about how we're going to tackle this. First, we're going to talk a little bit about you. Then we'll get into some of the meat and bones of the book. And thirdly, obviously, as you just mentioned, against the backdrop of Thatcher's Britain. So, who is John Wight? I hear you ask. So, John, you're an author and you write fiction and non-fiction. You've written a fictional book here in Gaza.
Yes.
One that's set in Edinburgh about metrosexuals. Aren't they all? I hear you say. The Reckoning Time about loyalist paramilitaries moving into Edinburgh.
Yes.
Very good. And then this isn't fiction. This is the boxing game about your love of pugilism.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh, and I saw this little tweet. Apart from the COVID lockdown here, you write, "What a mad time it was to be alive. I stand by this message." Now, if you'll allow me, I'll play a little video which sort of sets the scene of who you are. This is I don't want to say rant. What would you call it if it's not a rant? It's a heartfelt plea.
A volcanic assertion of fact.
All right, so let's check this out.
Boris Johnson carries about as much weight in Scotland as a fly's wing. That this Eton-educated, unreconstructed balloon thinks that just days after announcing 100,000 UK COVID deaths, he can come up here and rouse support for the union, just confirms how utterly divorced both he and the class he represents are from reality. 100,000 dead. And you have the gall, you have the pristine affront to claim that Westminster's approach to COVID is a case for the union, is a case for Scotland remaining in the union. You want to get an understanding of the fruits of your work on COVID, you fucking arsehole. Don't visit a vaccination centre, visit the fucking morgue. You'll see the bodies piled high due to your criminal negligence and incompetence. You're not leading a government, you're leading a death cult, pretending to be one. You can only dine out on the myths surrounding the Second World War for so long. British obscurantism has no place in Scotland, and it does not have the answers to the challenges in the 21st century. Scotland needs to move forward as a modern democratic republic, whose identity is gained not through its history of warmongering or from the size of its military or nuclear arsenal, but from the size of the justice and equality that it provides for all of its people, regardless of race, creed, colour, or anything else. There is no such thing anymore as a homogenous British working class. Brexit makes that clear. Brexit is an emotional reach back in time to a supposed golden age when Britannia ruled the waves and the Union Jack flew wherever it damn well pleased. Stick your fucking Union Jack up your arse. We've had enough. We are not a Tory country. We are a collectivist society in Scotland, and despite decades of being battered and bruised by Thatcherism, we retain that collectivist identity. It's stamped into our DNA. It's over, Boris Johnson. Nothing you can do can halt the demise of this 19th century post-colonial theme park. Peace out.
Well, let's go over to Stephen for his reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to find anything there to disagree with. I agree with every single word spoken there. I think one of the things, maybe to jump ahead a little bit here, one of the things I love about modern Scotland is you don't see the sort of I'm all right Jack mentality that seems to have become norm throughout most Western societies, and we haven't seen out with our friends from across the city, there hasn't been any significant rise of the far right in Scotland, and I think that's a testament to the community spirit that still lives there, and that's in stark contrast to England and even Ireland, where the far right are on the march. So an immense source of pride to me, living overseas, that we still retain that, as John puts it, the collectivist attitude, which is for sure part of our DNA.
We're all Jock Damson's bairns. That's part of Scottish working class identity, and we're proud of it.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move it on then. These are some of the articles that you've written, recurring themes: Ukraine, Palestine, Scottish independence. And I note here there's a mention of P. Diddy. That's been a recurring theme on A Celtic World over the past few weeks. Yes, it seems you had a one-on-one encounter with P. Diddy at a party in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So hold on. Microphone check 1, 2. What is this? You down with the diddler, white boy?
Yeah, I spent a few years living in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, and I was working as a security guard, bodyguard for VIP security. And so I was around a lot of celebrities at these kind of events, and this was an especially remarkable event. It was an MTV Awards after party in 2001 when the awards were held in LA. The party was hosted by P. Diddy, and it was a who's who of Hollywood stars and sporting celebrities. All of them now probably would deny that they were even there for obvious reasons. And it was just a bacchanalia, it was just crazy. There were loads of people trying to get in who weren't on the guest list, and it was like a mini riot ensued. The police had to come and shut the party down. Then he came out. I was standing at the gate as the guests were all leaving, and he came right up to me and he says, "Yo, where's my car? Where the fuck?" No, he says, "Where's the fuck's my car?" And I said, "I don't know." He says, "Where the fuck are you from? Australia?" I says, "No, Scotland." He says, "You work here?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Where the fuck's my car?" I said, "I have no idea." And he got one of the valleys. So obviously with all the furore over what's come out about the guy, I thought it'd be an interesting anecdote and an interesting story for somebody who's on the other side of that kind of particular world but who's there up close and personal, as I was. It was held in this lavish mansion in Bel Air. It was hard to describe the obscenity of the wealth and the ostentation that was on display. Everybody wanted to be part of that world, wanted to be there, and it made me really rethink my motives for being there. I was there trying to ostensibly establish a career as a screenwriter, and so I was doing these jobs to make ends meet. And it was a very interesting insight into that rarefied world of Hollywood and all that goes with it.
Yeah, and you were saying that a couple of miles away in downtown LA, there's tent cities
Terrible.
and thousands of people on the streets, and the opulence that you witnessed was just
the contrast. And I mean, I remember I was an extra on a Steven Spielberg movie, Minority Report, Tom Cruise, and that was shot. It was a night, so that was shot downtown LA in an underground station. I'm actually in a scene with Tom Cruise, if you see the movie, but obviously much younger and slimmer. And I, coming back to my apartment, which was in Hollywood, I took a wrong turn and I ended up in Skid Row, driving down Skid Row, and it was just something out of Mad Max. It was just a complete dystopia. There's hundreds of human beings hunkered down, rats as big as cats roaming around freely. It just gives you an insight into the contradictions of that country. It is a country and a society of huge contradictions. It's presented as the land of the free, which is and land of opportunity, which I consider to be a myth. But it's been able to attract thousands of people like me wanting to escape, the relative poverty of home and looking to try and be something different and so on. And that's how it generates its myth, and that's how it continues to enjoy such a massive part in world culture. I would call it cultural imperialism. It radiates this idea that America is the greatest country in the world, and it's where you have to be or want to be if you want to be successful in life, whatever that means.
Wow. Also bringing a little bit of glamour to A Celtic World. What do you think of that, Steve? We've got a Hollywood star in our midst.
Yeah, well, we can't match that, can we? No, it's very glamorous. No, I mean, never even been close to being at a P. Diddy party, so...
Okay,
I used to take in a few Celtic games when I was there. There was a Celtic supporters club in every corner of the world. There was a thriving Celtic supporters club in Los Angeles. Yeah. And the games would be shown live in an Irish pub down in Santa Monica at 6 a.m. for the time difference. And you'd walk in and you think you just walked into East Kilbride. It was just, I always found it quite amazing. So I'd occasionally go and watch a game if I felt I needed an injection of home, to try and keep me oriented. And that was quite interesting. I actually watched Celtic play. Obviously, I'm digressing here. But Celtic played Porto in the UEFA Cup final in 2003. I watched that game in a pub in Sunset Boulevard, I recall. That was an interesting experience, yeah. So Celtic's always followed me wherever I've been, regardless of what I'm doing at any given time.
Okay. Well, let's move it on then to talking about Celtic in the 80s. So, if you just look here, the 80s were a period of reasonable success, 4 league titles in the 80s.
Yeah.
Less successful than the previous couple of decades, obviously far more successful than the 90s. Why else do you think that the 1980s are so ripe for a book?
I think it's such a rich history, social history. I consider it the most turbulent decade, the post-war era in British Scottish social history, because of Thatcher and what she imposed on society. I would describe it as a mass experiment in human despair, masquerading as modernisation. It upended working class communities or working class lives. You had lots of things going on in the background. You had the Falklands War, you had the Irish hunger strikes, the Troubles were raging in Ireland, which was a very important backdrop to that time. And it influenced Celtic and the identity of the club and the controversy surrounding the songs, etc. You had the miners' strike, and you had real waves of discontent. The crime rate went up, and drugs became a big thing in the 80s. And that was all because of Thatcher. And she wanted to break the power of the unions. She wanted to break the organising power of the working class. And unfortunately, she was successful. Probably right up until the poll tax at the end of the 80s, when working class communities fought back on a community basis, not on a conventional industrial basis in the workplace.
Okay, well, let's start with the 1980 Scottish Cup final.
Yeah.
That's where your book begins.
Yes.
And of course, we will have all seen these scenes.
Yep.
I'll play this video and I'll try and keep the volume down so you can talk over it, John.
Look at these angry scenes on the terrace.
I mean, that was a day I'll never forget. Setting the tone for that day was when I got off the bus and was marching towards Hampden. I came across a Rangers supporter bus that had obviously made a wrong turning and ended up in the Celtic end. And there was not a window in the bus intact. It was surrounded with Celtic fans who were hurling bottles and cans and missiles at it. And the Rangers fans on the bus were trying to fight back. And that set the tone for the day. For some reason, I don't know why, the intensity of that game was of an order that I've never experienced at any other old format I've ever attended. I think maybe the stakes, it was the first Celtic Rangers Cup final, I think, since 1977, which Celtic had won. 1-0 penalty, Andy Lynch. But the intensity was it was off the scale. And obviously what happened after the game had a far-reaching impact on the Scottish game, because after that the government brought in the alcohol ban, which is maintained to this day at matches. But pure hatred. I mean, that's pure hatred. Archie McPherson said it right. Says these fans hate one another. And also remember, actually, there was a half-time entertainment consisted of an American majorettes band. They were brought over from the States, and they were sitting in the stand watching this unfold at the end of the match. And I think they thought they were in another world. Look at that. It was just crazy.
Let's bring Stephen in. Stephen, you lived through the 80s as a Celtic fan, much like John, and you obviously remember those scenes and that run to the final.
Yeah, I remember that game, watching it on the TV. I wasn't old enough to go to the game. I wasn't allowed to go to Celtic Rangers games at that particular time. I was only 10 in 1980. But I was at the semi-final, which was a pretty memorable game in its own right, where Celtic played Hibs at Hampden. Celtic won 5-0 with a hat-trick from Bobby Lennox. And George Best played for it in the Hibs side. So that's one of my claim to fame, is that I actually saw George Best playing. Obviously not in his heyday, but I managed to see him. And that was really the sort of start. That year was the start of my sort of Celtic awakening, if you like, where I fell in love with Celtic and going to see Celtic games. My dad wasn't a Celtic fan. My dad was a Kilmarnock fan, having been born and bred in Kilmarnock. So he wasn't really down with taking me to Celtic games. He was a bit nervous, to be honest with you, and he'd already taken me that year to the game against Real Madrid in the quarter-final of a European Cup earlier on in 1980. So that was really my first experience of being at a really big match. And then we went along to the Hibs semi-final, which was really excellent as well. Bobby Lennox, being an Ayrshire boy, Bobby Lennox is a bit of a local hero for me. He was born just 2 towns down from where I'm from. So it was great to see him, albeit at the tail end of his career. But I remember watching the game on the TV, live on the TV, and pretty nervous match, not much between two evenly matched teams. And it took a goal, a fortuitous deflection of George McCluskey from a Danny McGrain shot in extra time to settle it. But great scenes, and then after the match, obviously, you know, the trouble on the park, and I don't know if my dad or my mum switched it off, but I don't remember too much about watching the actual violence on the park. I was just aware that something bad had happened, and obviously there was a lot of ramifications in the weeks and months after that, and as John says, it led to a complete alcohol ban in the stadium. I mean, prior to that, there was so much alcohol being drank in football matches. I remember standing next to it on the terraces. I was just a wee boy standing next to guys with full bags of cans, just drinking the can. After they finished drinking the can, they'd actually take a piss in the can, and then quite often I quite often lob it after that, it's either onto the park or to rival fans or something. And as we boys, we tended to stand down near the front, and you know, it was such a danger zone because you're getting you're high risk of getting hit in the head by a piss-filled can of Tennent's or something, you know. So very grim. Compared to
it was a grim time. I remember the river urine coming down the terrace and in the jungle. They'd been trickling down the steps, you know, regularly. It was quite barbaric, actually, in Scottish society. You know, people were less refined than they are now. Pretty wild, very rough and ready on the bus. You know, big wallsy cigarette smoke and people drinking and singing, and it was just raucous. There was an authenticity, though. Maybe I'm being guilty of looking back through the prism of nostalgia, but there was a kind of authenticity about it then, because people were what they were. And I just think the football became merged with that kind of sense of defiance of people's lived conditions. You know, it was hard for people. And, you know, I just think when the fans in those days that were singing, they coming together, it gave them a sense of identity that they no longer had as working class people in their communities. And that's where I think Celtic, and obviously Rangers for other reasons, had that role. But I mean, in the jungle, it was just an unbelievable mass of anger, and also pride in the club's history. I mean, rebel songs were ubiquitous then. I mean, it was every second song was a rebel song, encomiums to the IRA and stuff, which were obviously controversial because the Troubles were raging. But for me, I embraced that. I didn't know much about the issue, but I did know that I'd suffered bullying and so on when I was younger for being one of the only Catholics in my housing scheme in the west side of Edinburgh. And I don't think you can deny that Celtic is more than a sporting institution. It's also a cultural, but also a political institution, despite the efforts of successive boards to sublimate that political identity for reasons of supposed propriety. And I think it's the Green Brigade today that keeps that alive within Celtic. I know not all Celtic fans agree. I do. I think they are the beating heart of the club in terms of keeping the history alive, keeping the legacy, keeping that unbroken thread of pride in an Irish identity that's rooted in resistance to British colonial rule.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, you talked about political identity. You got into a spot of bother at that game for your flag, didn't you?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
I'd procured a green, white and gold Union Jack at one of the sellers outside Parkhead a few weeks before, and I thought this was great. You know, this was like a kind of counterintuitive thing. The Union Jack with green, white and gold, and I was waving that merrily at that Scottish Cup final. I was on the pitch. I thought that we were on the pitch celebrating, and then when I saw the fans running back, they were back and forth chasing each other, I got grabbed by this big police officer, and he just threw me back over the fence. So I'm leaving, and I'm discombobulated. You know, it's crazy. I'm a bit shaken up and all the rest of it. I'm now desperate to find the bus to get home because there'd been a big delay because of the disorder and so on. And I'm marching towards the bus park, and this big guy says, "Oh, wee man, get rid of that fucking Union Jack." I says, "But mister, it's green, white and gold." He says, "I'm not giving a fuck, it's a Union Jack, get it to fuck." So I threw it in the bin. Suitably chastened.
Very good. All right, shall we move it on then in the 80s? Let's take in a few more pictures. This is 1982, isn't it?
Yep.
I think.
Murder McLeod.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Celtic produced some fantastic players. Charlie Nicholas, Brian McClare, Morris Johnson. There had some great flair players in the 80s. Davy Coven. You know, McGrain was still moving up and down that wing like a train. They had some really good players. Ray Aitken, Tommy Burns was a wonderful ball player. On their day, Celtic played some really attractive stuff in that period.
86, the famous Love Street game.
5-0.
Stephen has spoken about that before on the show. Were you both present?
I wasn't at that game though.
Yeah, I was there. There. That was a absolutely phenomenal experience. Really wet day. It was pissing down with rain, you know, as it often is in Glasgow. But I remember going out to that game with not a great deal of hope that we were going to win the league. I think most people were just looking to get a good result to finish the season. But when I'll never forget it. It was in the, as you'll remember yourself, in those days there was no live TV. The only way you could you would find out the score from another game was through the radio, and there was always somebody around about you in the crowd who was listening to a radio to find out what was happening in the other games. And the roar that went up when Albert Kidd scored the first of his 2 goals for Dundee against Hearts, I'll never forget to my dying day, and the way it just spread through the whole end at Love Street, and all the Celtic fans began to think, well, this is going to be it. And then almost straight away, it was almost an imperceptible amount of time had passed, and it was 2-0 to Dundee. Albert Kidd again. It was almost unbelievable by that point. Yeah. And after that, it was just party time. And the scenes on the TV, if you ever get a chance to watch it back, you'll see the goalkeeper Jim Stewart from St Mirren has the ball in his hands, and then everybody just goes ballistic in the goal behind him. So absolutely fantastic day, and right up there with one of my best days as a Celtic supporter.
What do you think? Do you remember the criticisms that was levelled at St Mirren, the accusations that they laid down to Celtic on that day? The Hearts fans were going mental about that. You couldn't believe that they would lose it on goal difference. I remember
that was crap. That was nonsense. Celtic were on a 17-game unbeaten run at that particular time, so we were the forum team in the league. Yeah. We hadn't been beaten ages. We were playing really good stuff, as you mentioned. There, we had some brilliant players. We had Brian McClare. We had Maurice Johnson up front. We had Paul McStay pulling the strings in midfield. Murdo McLeod, Danny McGray in his pomp. And I know for a fact the goalkeeper for St Mirren, we've just mentioned, Jim Stewart, he was a big Hun. He used to play for, I don't know if it was before or after that, but he played for Rangers at some point in his career. And he wouldn't, no way he was going to be lying down to that. So we were just so good that day. The passing, I think it was the third goal, which was a flowing passing move started by Danny McGrain, and then ended up with Brian McClare breaking free, and he crossed for Maurice Johnson to score. That's one of the best goals the Celtic have ever scored, that's right up there. So we just blew them off the park, and we were a form team in the country at the time, and really deserved league winners. We'd started the season fairly poorly and gave ourselves a mountain to climb. But you go on an unbeaten run like that, you're never going to be far away at the end of the season when the prizes get dished out.
I think that was the most consequential title win game for Celtic since the 79 title win when the 10 men beat Rangers at Parkhead 4-2. I think it had the same kind of impact because of the drama. It was a dramatic moment in Celtic's history and in Scottish football history. Yeah, wonderful.
And that McClare goal is like a goal from the modern era almost. It really stands out, from back then when it was also blood and thunder and up and at 'em and all that. It's a gorgeous goal.
I think McClare was a fantastic player. Sometimes don't think he gets enough credit he deserves because a lot of his career was spent in Manchester United. He's more seen as a Manchester United icon than a Celtic icon. And obviously he played alongside Maurice Johnson, who was more flamboyant, and he had that sort of more flamboyant image off the park. But McClare was phenomenal. He could do everything. He could hold the ball up. He could link up. Great finisher. 2-footed player. He was a wonderful player. I just wish he'd stayed at Celtic longer. But obviously the lure of Manchester United was too great to resist.
Yeah, he had a brilliant career there. Well, he's kind of flamboyant these days in his own way, isn't he?
He's become a bit of a hippie. He's become a bit of a kind of hippie.
Yes, but he does that. Yeah, he does an excellent podcast, Life with Brian, and it really is worth listening to. He's got a lot of interesting things to say about not just football, but culture in general, including politics. And anybody that's met him, and a couple of the guys on our show, Gav, I've met him, and they'll testify that he's just a great guy, and still maintains a burning love for Celtic. I know he's more of a Manchester United icon now, but he still maintains a season ticket at Celtic Park. He still takes he still takes his boys along there whenever he gets a chance. So I think he'd probably still consider himself to be a Celtic fan, even although he's a Man United icon.
Excellent. I didn't know that.
1988, Celtic celebrate the Centenary season. This is your favourite ever season, I think, Stephen, you said before.
Yeah.
winning the first double in 11 years.
I was at that game.
Yeah.
It's one of the last games I went to. It was almost like destiny took a hand. The Centenary year, winning the double. The scene was set. I remember the atmosphere being wonderfully celebratory. Certainly in contradistinction to the 80 Cup final atmosphere. It was joyous. It was a great day to be a Celtic supporter. It just seemed, it was like it was a script. McAvenny, he was great in those days, and we were destined to win that because Brother Walfred was looking down upon us that day, I think.
Yeah, I think the whole season was kind of like that. To be honest with you, we had just such brilliant results and such memorable games right through that season. We had the New Year fixture where we beat Rangers 2-0 at Celtic Park. We also had a game up at Aberdeen late on in the season. This was at a time when we didn't win up there very often at all. When Andy Walker scored a late winner in a midweek match, which more or less sealed the title for us in that season. And also, we talk about a last minute winner in the cup final, but there was a last minute winner in the semi final as well, where we were minutes away from going out to Hearts in the semi final. And we got 2 late goals there, both from Mark McGee. One from Mark McGee and the second one from Andy Walker after Mark McGee had headed the ball in a challenge with Henry Smith, the Hearts goalkeeper. So that was a great occasion as well. And the whole season, as you rightly say, John, it seems as if destiny had just decided that Celtic were going to be successful. So yeah, one of my favourite seasons.
Wonderful.
And then the 80s. Well, this is 1989. Winning the Scottish Cup. Great scenes there. It's a great photograph, isn't it?
Isn't it? It's iconic.
Yeah.
That was before the Celtic end was covered. That was interesting to be there when it was uncovered. And regardless, when the Celtic played at Hampden, the volume of the fans was hardly diminished by the lack of a cover over that part of the terracing.
Your memories of that, Stephen?
Great occasion, that one. Another 2 years in a row, we had really hot weather on Cup final day, and it was absolutely roasting that day. I remember being absolutely steaming drunk on a bottle of Buckfast watching that game, so my memory of it is a little bit hazy. But looking back on it now, I always look at that game with a touch of regret, because I always know that the whole Maurice Johnston saga was bubbling in the background round about that time, and we all went to that game we thought in the knowledge that Maurice Johnston was rejoining the club, and the next season we were going to be a force again in Scottish football. And it was in the week after the cup final that everything started to fall apart with that. So tinged with a bit of regret. We had lost the league already. Rangers were going for a treble at that cup final, so we did manage to deny them the treble. But with a bit of a backs to the wall performance, not really vintage Celtic, and the Maurice Johnston thing sort of pulled the rug from under us within the next few days for the cup final. I was having a look, I think, back to that particular saga today, and it was a dreadful time to be a Celtic fan. And the worst thing about it was the effect it had on Billy McNeill, who was a Celtic legend. And I think if I ever had a chance to talk to Maurice Johnston again, that would be the question I would ask him. How do you feel about what you did to Billy McNeill? Because he took that really personally. And I don't think he ever really recovered. Certainly his managerial career at Celtic never recovered, and I just don't think as a person he really recovered. It was such a shock to the system, and that's why for me Johnston will never be forgiven by the Celtic fans.
It was a real humiliation for Billy McNeill, as you say, and he thought he was personally close to Johnston, and he'd verbally agreed to sign, and he was known to be a Celtic man, or he claimed to be. And he'd had a great rapport with the fans his first time round at the club. And it was all about money. And the Soonest Revolution was starting to bear fruit at Rangers. And it was simply because Rangers were willing to pay his tax bill. I believe that's why he went to Rangers instead of Celtic at the last minute. Completely mercenary act. And you're right, he'll never be forgiven. I remember he lived in Edinburgh when he played for Rangers. And I used to know the guy who was his personal bodyguard. And he couldn't go anywhere without a bodyguard. This is a big guy. He was called Big George, Australian George. As the name suggests, he was Australian. Nice guy. And he had to follow him everywhere. So regardless of his success at Rangers, I don't think it would probably be a happy time for him personally off the park because he had to watch his back all the time. It was a stupid move, actually, in many ways, because
I think one of I think one of the reasons behind it was that Celtic had insisted that they didn't go through, the transfer wasn't to be handled by Bill McMurdo, who was a big Hun and a big Tory.
Right.
They didn't want him to have anything to do with the transfer, so they negotiated with Johnston directly and with Johnston's club, who were FC Nantes in France. They negotiated with him directly, but when McMurdo found out about this, he did everything he could to scupper this deal, and he found out that it was something to do with the rights to the contract weren't fully owned by Nantes or something like that, and Celtic. And this was just another example of the Celtic board's incompetence. Celtic could have prevented him ever kicking a ball for Rangers. We held his registration and it was all legal and binding with UEFA and FIFA. But Celtic, the board, decided to capitulate and just let him sign for Rangers because it was the cheaper thing to do. And they didn't have to pay him any money. They didn't have to pay the transfer fee. So we could have held him. And I believe Billy McNeill wanted us to. But the board said no. So... the
Celtic board in those days was terrible. You're right; they were completely incompetent. Their heads were stuck in the past. David Murray had come in, this successful businessman. He transformed the way football was. Obviously, it led to Sevco. We realised he was at it, but he transformed the way a football club was run in Scotland. He was commercially minded. He brought Souness in. Souness used his clout in the game to bring out all this host of these English stars, benefiting from the fact that these English teams had been banned from Europe because of the Heysel disaster. And so the stars had aligned for Rangers to the extent that they had disaligned for Celtic in that period. And you're right, it was a very disappointing, hard time to be a Celtic fan, watching what was going on across the other side of the city and the lack of imagination and ideas that were in place in the Celtic boardroom at this point. And obviously, you had the stadium needed to be revamped. Then the Fergus McCann era began, and things changed for football. They became more commercially minded than they had been before. But I think Rangers set the tone for that, and Celtic found it hard to catch up. Even though they had some really good teams in the 90s, it was Rangers' decade by and large, wasn't it?
Stumbled across a couple of quotes attributed to Maurice Johnson from fairly recently, I think, today. As I was doing my extensive research, as you know, I do, Gav, for these shows, and apparently he still maintains that the highlight of his footballing career was Love Street in '86 when Celtic won the league, and he still considers himself to be a Celtic supporter. Whether any other Celtic supporter would still consider him to be a Celtic supporter is a different matter. But that, for what it's worth, that's what he says.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that in all the time I've known you, Steve, you've only ever referred to him as he who shall not be named or the unmentionable. So the fact that you've dropped his name so many times tonight is a surprise to me. Where is he these days anyway? What's he doing?
I think he lives in Kansas. He went to decamp to the States
right.
years ago. He had a career in American football, American soccer, and then I think he managed the team over there. But I think last time I heard, he lives in Kansas.
Well, I think his career over in MLS finished about 2010. He ended up, you're right, he was with Kansas. Yeah, so I was going to say Maurice Johnston's currently running his own sports management company, I believe, down in Florida. I managed to stalk him through LinkedIn today and found out what he's doing. But it's a bit light on information as to what he's actually doing, but I believe that's what he's doing. But he hasn't been involved in professional football for about, maybe 10, 15 years now.
Is Paul McStay not doing the same kind of thing in Australia, sports management or something similar?
I think Paul McStay's here in Sydney actually, but I think it was some sort of web design company Paul came down here to start with. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, he was doing some sort of sports management company, Maestro Sports.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. Well, let's move it on a little bit to the political backdrop. You're obviously a very political animal, John.
Yeah.
So set the scene as to what was going on in Thatcher's Britain in the 80s.
Well, that was really the event that triggered my political consciousness, the sheer scale of the injustice, plus the campaign, the militancy of the campaign, civil disobedience. And that's when I started to become politicised. Prior to that, I'd been kind of politicised by my relationship with Celtic in terms of the Irish struggle. In those days, at Parkhead, you'd get activists outside the game handing out leaflets trying to raise money for various Irish Republican causes and groups, and obviously the songs. And so it triggered me to sort of embrace that identity. And I understood that I was part of a minority community that had suffered deep anti-Irish Catholic racism, bigotry, which has deep cultural roots in Scotland, as you'll know. And that really deepened my love of Celtic. Because Celtic was formed on the back of that, because Irish immigrants in the late 19th century, early 20th century, their assimilation into Scottish society was blocked. So they had to come up with these self-help organisations, and Celtic was part of that movement. And not many people know this. This is an interesting, I was doing my research like Kevin. Celtic's, Brother Walfred's inspiration for Celtic was Hibs, Hibernian. And when Hibs were formed, they were more Catholic than the Pope. You had to actually be a practicing Catholic to play for Hibernian when they were formed. James Connolly was a Hibernian supporter, and Brother Walfred saw the opportunity of replicating what Hibs were doing in the east of Scotland and the west, and he invited Hibs through to play a couple of charity matches before Celtic were formed against various Catholic teams like St. Peter's, church teams, etc., chapel teams, and they drew huge crowds. And Hibs had a big fan base in Glasgow at the time because of their Catholic identity. So that was quite an interesting footnote in the history of Celtic and its formation, and Brother Walfred establishing Celtic to help cater to the poor Irish Catholics in the west of Scotland. And it was actually Brother Walfred who was the first person in Scotland to bring in the idea of free school meals for kids, for poor kids, which he did in the west of Scotland at its Catholic schools. So it's a wonderful kind of merging of culture and politics at the time, when there was a real ferment of tension in Scotland because of the arrival of huge waves of Irish immigrants from Ireland in the back of the big hunger, the hunger strike, and then the succeeding privation suffered by Irish people, largely due to the role of British capitalism and capital penetration in that part of the world. And so Celtic is, to my mind, a political institution, and it remains so to this day. And that's why I really do admire the Green Brigade for maintaining that history, as I've mentioned it. I think it will continue, and I think as long as the fans understand that and keep that alive, Celtic will always be more than just a football club.
Yeah, and of course Glasgow Hibernian was almost the name, or was certainly considered for the name. Much like Dundee United started off, Dundee Hibernian.
Dundee United started off as Dundee Hibernian. They played in green, but they and Hibs sublimated their Irish Catholic identities. I think Dundee did it because they felt that they'd be more commercially viable, and Hibs did it because they didn't want to alienate other parts of the Scottish community. Whereas Celtic have only kept their identity, even though Celtic have always had a policy of playing not just Catholic players, non-Catholic players. The non-sectarian identity fits in with the Irish Republican history, which is a non-sectarian creed at source, if you go back to Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen.
Okay, I'm going to just play a little video here.
Acknowledge that Margaret Thatcher was one of the most formidable politicians of recent times. To her family, to her friends, to her colleagues, to her supporters, I extend the condolences of the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru. It'd be wrong, however, not to put on record our profound disagreement with her socially and economic divisive policies, which were particularly opposed in Scotland and Wales. We will never forget, we will never forgive the poll tax being imposed on Scots a year before the rest of the UK. No country should have such policies imposed on them when they were rejected at the ballot box, and the existence of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh National Assembly follows this experience. Margaret Thatcher will be remembered for a long time in Scotland and Wales. She helped remind us that we have a national consensus that values society, values solidarity and values community. For that, at least, we can be grateful.
Angus Robertson there.
Yeah, apart from the fact that Ian Paisley Jr. was in the background.
Yeah, I saw that, looking decidedly disenchanted.
Those are some good words there. I think he chose them quite well on the occasion.
Yeah, I didn't like the throat clearing exercise of paying, tribute to her and paying, giving his commiserations, etc. But he's a politician, I suppose he had to do that. But he did make some good points about her legacy in Scotland, her poisonous legacy in Scotland, which is why the Tories today don't have a foothold in this country, thank God, and why they've been, the SNP have come to ascendancy, although they're suffering their own reverses for different reasons now. So politics in Scotland is in a state of flux. It's a kind of period of interregnum. There's no sign of any second referendum coming on the horizon anytime soon. And working class people are split across these islands after deindustrialisation, and everything in Scotland now happens through the prism of Scottish national identity, not through class, because of deindustrialisation. And we saw the huge disjuncture between Scotland and people in Scotland voting heavily to remain in the EU in 2016, and people in large swathes of deindustrialised England and South Wales voting to Brexit. And I think that contradiction will not be able to be overcome anytime soon. So it's an interesting time to be alive in Scotland, but I think we need some kind of sense of direction, which is lacking right now because of the travails that have engulfed the SNP.
Okay, I was just about to share some more pics here of, how Thatcher is still, a figure of division and hate, and how Celtic fans haven't forgotten that.
Yeah, I mean, Celtic have been a repository of hatred of Thatcher, particularly because of her role with regards to the Irish hunger strikes, where she refused to budge and to negotiate and allowed 10 men to die for the sake of being considered political prisoners. And I think her hatred at Celtic Park is especially deep because of that, and long-lasting.
And of course, the Celtic fans issued these cards, didn't they, to show her when she was up in Scotland?
Yes, that's right. I'm surprised she felt minded to show her face. I think this is why Celtic does such controversy and such passions, because if you remember a few years back, stupidly I think, the Scottish Football Association wanted a minute's silence to commemorate that year's Remembrance Day. And Green Gibby put on a fantastic display with the signs, the placards saying no bloodstained poppies on our shirts. Remember, they had the poppies that were being put on the shirts. Caused a lot of controversy. People don't understand. Celtic fans understand that have a different relationship to the British state and to the legacy of the British Army than everyone else in the country, because of their role in Derry and Bloody Sunday and the Ballymurphy massacre and the legacy of the Troubles and internment, etc., and what befell the hunger strikers. And they can't deal with that. And they're going to have to, because to my mind, and maybe we'll disagree on this, I don't see Celtic as a Scottish institution. I see Celtic as an Irish institution based in Scotland. And that's what gives its wonderful identity, its unique identity, and that's what makes it a controversial institution on a regular basis. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. 1980, Sean O'Grady, an Irish-American boxer, came over to fight Jim Watt for Jim Watt's world lightweight title. And there was a league match at Kilmarnock the weekend before the fight, which was being held, I can't remember where it was being held, at Kelvin Hall. And Sean O'Grady's team approached Celtic to see if he could appear to try and generate some publicity for the fight, because he was fairly unknown. And he was from Oklahoma, Irish-American, and the Celtic board agreed to let him appear on the pitch at half-time. And what was an ordinary league match, Celtic were winning 2-1 at the time. I think they went on to win 4-1. Sean O'Grady appeared at half-time. Everybody's mingling about. You remember those days, go and get their pie, go and have a piss or whatever they do. And this guy's appeared, and he's announced over the tannoy, and he's got the 10-gallon hat, and he's got the denim, he's in cowboy attire. And he pulled off his denim jacket, and he had a Celtic top on. And the crowd went nuts. And the Kilmarnock fans, and what was then the Rangers end, which was unsegregated, they kicked off. There was a fight in the Celtic, the Rangers end. And the rendition of the Soldier song that came out for the Jungle is the loudest I've ever heard. And that just shows you, the Kilmarnock fans and Scottish society in general lambasted Celtic for supporting this Irish-American boxer over the Scottish boxer. But that just gives you an insight into why we are different. We happen to be in Scotland, but I don't think we're off Scotland. I don't think so. I think we're an Irish immigrant club and an institution, and I think that's why a lot of the rest of Scottish society try and find ways to try and undermine Celtic. We saw the thing with the flag. I think it was in the 1950s or the 60s. They tried to get them to remove the tricolour or be suspended from the league. I don't know if you're aware of that campaign that was waged by parts of the Rangers and parts of the SFA, and they failed. So this is the difference when it comes to Celtic, when it comes regards to every other club, not even in Scotland, but even in the whole of the UK, that we are in hostile territory in many respects. And the defiance that emanates from the fans is part of that understanding, whether it's conscious or not, that we are in hostile territory, but we are defiant regardless.
No hostile territory for you here, John. You're very welcome onto A Celtic World, and it's been great to hear your crack and all your stories, and to give us a little insight into the book. What's the book called again, and do you have any artwork for it yet?
Not yet. Jungle Days Supporting Celtic in the 1980s. It'll be part personal memoir, part social history, and of course history of Celtic in that decade on the park. I'll look through seminal games. I won't go every game every season. It'll be an attempt to get into the why of Celtic rather than just focusing on the what. And I'll be tackling the deep cultural roots of anti-Irish racism and bigotry, anti-Irish Catholic racism and bigotry in Scotland. I don't think you can write a book like this without taking on that issue, which I think is important to understand where Celtic comes from and why it's so important to this day as an institution.
And do you have any idea when it's going to come out?
Next April or May has been mooted. I've just started working on it. I'm going to start working on it in earnest next week. I think I sent you the first chapter. And then, I'm quite a daunting prospect. The idea was percolating in my head for a number of years. I kept coming back to it. I kept saying, no, it's a difficult subject. It's a heavy responsibility to tackle it properly because of, the Celtic fans and the huge amount of support and love there is for the club. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it now.
Well, that sounds like Stephen's birthday present for next year then. Is sorted.
I'm looking forward to I'll send you a signed copy. I'll send you a signed copy.
Fantastic.
What I'll do is, if you want, I'll get in touch with you nearer the time, and if you want to do another one when the book's out, and then we can. I'm sure I'll be doing some book events around some Celtic clubs, supporters clubs. I may try and get out to the Celtic convention in Vegas with the book, and that should be a nice experience. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Good stuff.
Stephen, how much are you looking forward to getting stuck into it?
Yeah, very much so. I've really enjoyed going back in time and having a chat about the 1980s. As I said, that was my formative years as a Celtic fan. I think it was a great decade to grow up as a Celtic fan. We had the full range of emotions with the highs of Love Street, the highs of the Centenary season, and the lows of the Maurice Johnston affair at the end of the decade. And as you mentioned, the social upheaval that was occurring at the time in Scotland. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. And I'm really looking forward to the book. Well, when it comes out, we'll do what we can to plug it through our own socials. And we'll see if we can create some interest down among the supporters clubs down here in Australia.
Excellent. One thing I can just say as a footnote, based on my experience in the 80s, I've never been more surprised to find Gordon Strachan would ever be a Celtic manager. He was hated by the Celtic fans in the 80s when he played.
He was, yeah.
I remember one league game, I was in the jungle, a Celtic fan ran on the pitch and attacked him. He was a hate figure among the Celtic fans because he was very good, he was very cocky, he was very arrogant, and for some reason he just became a lightning rod outside the Old Firm. I think he was the most hated player among the fans in the jungle of any in that period. So I was always amazed when he became Celtic manager. He's now quite a beloved figure among a lot of Celtic fans, but maybe not the generation I was part of.
Poor wee Gordon.
Yeah.
Well, I think the 1984 Scottish Cup final, Celtic had played Aberdeen, and I don't know if you remember this one. Roy Aitken got sent off really early on in the game, and it was an innocuous tackle, and I think it was Mark McGee, who also went on to play for Celtic later. But Strachan was right up at the referee, who was, I'm pretty sure it was Bob Valentine. I could be wrong there. But Strachan was right up at him saying, send them off. And sure enough, he produced a red card. It was a straight red for not very much at all. And we ended up losing that game in extra time. So I don't think the Celtic fans ever really forgave Strachan for that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. If somebody had told you he was going to be a Celtic manager, and pretty successful Celtic manager at that, you would never have believed them.
Crazy how things change.
Okay, well, look, I get the feeling we could talk all night, but we're going to have to bring the curtain down on this show. Thank you very much, John, for being with us. It's been fantastic.
Been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I look forward to doing it again sometime, and I look forward to getting stuck into this book. And some of your insights have been most invaluable about some of the games and your own experiences. It's obviously it's a portal to an entirely different world in all shapes and sizes. Pre-internet, pre-smartphones, the social mores in those days could not have been more different. In some ways better, in some ways clearly worse. But people love nostalgia, and I think Celtic fans like their history. So I'm hoping I'll do this subject justice, and the people who get the book thoroughly enjoy it.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, both of you, very much. It's been a great episode. Until next time.
Thanks, John.
Hail, hail.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Cheers.
Hail, hail.
Thank you.